Theron's chest exploded in 3 directions before his body understood what dying felt like. Blood spread across August concrete, while 6-year-old Marlo screamed behind him, her pink backpack still bouncing against her shoulders. Everything that happened next would rewrite the power structure of Jersey City, but in that moment, there was only the taste of copper and the distant sound of silenced gunfire echoing off brick walls. 48 days earlier, the same boy had been nothing, a shadow living between restaurant dumpsters and wine crates, invisible to everyone who mattered. The alley behind Rosso Elegante smelled like garlic, expensive cologne, and the Hudson River's industrial rot that clung to everything after dark. He'd claimed the space behind the loading dock 3 months prior, after 2 older kids had beaten him bloody for a spot under the overpass. The restaurant's back wall provided shelter from rain, and the kitchen staff's cigarette breaks followed a schedule he'd memorized down to the minute. Tuesdays and Fridays, the sous chef dumped barely touched plates into the bin around 11. Osso buco, risotto with actual saffron, bread still warm enough to steam. Theron ate like a stray dog, fast and alert, always watching the steel door for sudden movements that meant danger or opportunity. His clothes carried 3 months of sweat and summer grime, the kind that no public restroom sink could wash away. The sneakers on his feet had separated from their soles, held together with duct tape he'd stolen from a construction site. Nobody looked at him long enough to see a human being, just another piece of urban debris cluttering the landscape. But he saw everything. The black SUVs that arrived precisely at 9:30 each evening, their windows tinted dark enough to be illegal. The men in tailored suits who moved with the rigid awareness of people trained to kill. The way conversations stopped when certain cars pulled up. How even the kitchen staff went quiet until those particular vehicles drove away. And he saw her. Marlo, with the pink backpack, who burst through the restaurant's side door every night, like she owned the world. She'd run across the narrow alley, her shoes lighting up with each step, heading straight for the man who waited by the SUV's open door. The man everyone called boss, in voices that mixed respect with primal fear. Theron had watched Draven end phone calls with single words that made grown men pale. He'd seen him slip a chef $500 for remembering his daughter's favorite dessert. Power and tenderness existed in the same body, switching between heartbeats. Marlo called him Daddy, in a voice that turned the most dangerous man in Jersey City into something soft and breakable. She'd climb into his arms despite the expensive suit, leaving sticky handprints on Italian wool that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Theron never meant to memorize their routine, but survival meant noticing patterns. 9:30 arrival, 12 minutes inside while Marlo ate tiramisu and told her father about school. 9:42 departure, Draven carrying his daughter to the vehicle, while bodyguards formed a moving perimeter around them both. He'd found the photograph 4 years ago in a bus station trash can, back when he still believed someone might be looking for him. The woman's face had stopped his heart, not because he remembered her, but because something in his chest recognized her anyway. The back of the photo said, "My everything," in handwriting that felt like a language he'd forgotten how to read. He kept it folded in his pocket, the creases so deep the image had started to separate along the lines. Some nights he'd take it out under the yellow alley light, studying her smile like it might reveal why he'd ended up sleeping in garbage while other kids had homes. The baby in her arms looked fat and happy, unaware that 15 years later he'd be eating from dumpsters. The summer heat made sleeping impossible most nights. Theron would lie on flattened cardboard, watching stars disappear behind Jersey City's light pollution, listening to the restaurant's after-hours sounds, dishwashers running, managers counting cash, sometimes laughter from the private dining room where deals got made over wine that cost more than he'd see in a year. August 23rd started like every other sweltering evening. The boy had collected enough cans to buy a bottle of water from the bodega 3 blocks down. His stomach cramped from hunger, but the kitchen wouldn't dump the good scraps for another 2 hours. He'd settled into his usual spot, invisible, patient, waiting. The SUV arrived at 9:30 exactly, its engine purring like a satisfied cat. Draven emerged first, his movement economical and precise, eyes scanning the alley with the automatic caution of someone who'd survived by being paranoid. The bodyguards fanned out, but their attention focused on the street, on rooftops, on approaching vehicles, not on the skinny kid bleeding into the shadows. Marlo bounced out 12 minutes later, her backpack catching the security light. She was talking about a science project, something about volcanoes. her hands gesturing wildly as she described the explosion she'd created in class. Draven smiled, a rare expression that transformed his entire face into something almost ordinary. That's when Theron noticed the wrong shadow. It moved against the building's natural darkness, 3 shapes separating from the brick wall, with the fluid certainty of predators. His heart recognized danger before his mind processed the details. The extended arms, the dull metal catching stray light, the angle of trajectory pointing directly at Marlowe's back. Theron's body moved before his brain finished calculating the impossibility of what he was attempting. His legs pushed off the cardboard with enough force to send wine crates toppling, the crash echoing through the alley like a warning bell no one would hear in time. Draven's head snapped toward the sound, his hand already reaching inside his jacket where Theron knew a weapon lived. But the bodyguards were turning the wrong direction, tracking the noise instead of the real threat materializing from the opposite wall. Professional training worked against them. They'd been conditioned to respond to obvious disturbances, not silent predators. Marlowe kept talking about her volcano, oblivious to the 3 barrels now aimed at the space between her shoulder blades. Her light-up shoes blinked red and blue against the concrete, a cheerful rhythm that didn't match the violence about to erupt. Theron's stolen sneakers made no sound as he crossed the distance between his hiding spot and her small body. The first gunman's finger was already squeezing the trigger when Theron's shoulder collided with Marlowe's backpack. The impact sent her sprawling sideways into her father's legs, her surprised yelp cutting through the humid air. Draven caught her reflexively, his body twisting to shield her even as his mind struggled to process why a homeless kid had just attacked his daughter. The first bullet hit Theron's chest before he'd finished his forward momentum. It felt like being punched by something made of fire and iron, the impact spinning him halfway around. He saw Draven's face transform from confusion to understanding in the space between heartbeats, saw the exact moment the boss realized what was actually happening. The second shot caught his shoulder as he fell, tearing through muscle and scraping bone with enough force to knock him completely sideways. Theron's vision whited out for a second, his body hitting the concrete hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Marlowe screaming his name, except she didn't know his name, so she was just screaming. The third bullet grazed his temple, close enough that he felt the heat of it passing. Blood ran into his eye, hot and sticky, turning half the world red. The bodyguards were firing now, their weapons making different sounds than the silenced ones, loud cracks that echoed off buildings and set off car alarms 3 blocks away. Theron's cheek pressed against concrete that still held the day's heat. He could smell motor oil and something sweet. Marlowe's strawberry shampoo, because she was crouching next to him now, her small hands trying to stop the bleeding. Draven was shouting orders in a voice that could have shattered glass, his weapon tracking the shadows where the gunman had been. But the assassins were already gone, melting back into the darkness like they'd never existed. Only the brass casings on the ground proved it hadn't been a nightmare. Those in the blood pooling around Theron's body, spreading in a circle that reflected the alley's security lights. Marlowe's face hovered above his, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pressed her pink backpack against his chest. The pressure sent fresh agony through his body, but he couldn't make his voice work to tell her to stop. She was saying something, the same words over and over, but they weren't reaching his brain correctly. Draven dropped to his knees beside them, his expensive suit soaking up blood without hesitation. His hands moved with surprising gentleness, checking for exit wounds and arterial bleeding with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. When he pressed against the shoulder wound, Theron's back arched, a sound escaping his throat that didn't seem human. More footsteps echoed through the alley, the bodyguards returning, restaurant staff spilling out the back door, voices overlapping in questions and panic. Someone was calling for an ambulance, but Draven cut them off with a single word that made everyone freeze. "My car. Now." He goes to Mercy Grace, Dr. Chen's unit. No questions, no records, no police. They lifted Theron between them, their hands impersonal and clinical despite the urgency. The world tilted and spun, concrete giving way to leather seats that smelled like Marlowe's strawberry shampoo and her father's cologne. The girl climbed in beside him, still pressing her backpack against his chest, her voice finally reaching him clearly. "Please don't die. Please don't die. Please don't die." Draven slid in on his other side, barking orders to the driver while simultaneously calling ahead to the hospital. But his free hand rested on Theron's forehead, checking for fever and shock with a gentleness that didn't match the violence in his voice when he promised someone on the phone that he'd personally kill them if his daughter's savior didn't survive. The SUV's tires screamed against asphalt, running red lights through downtown Jersey City. Through the tinted windows, Theron watched streetlights blur into continuous lines of gold. His pocket felt heavy where the photograph rested, that folded piece of paper that was the only proof he'd ever been someone's everything. Pain was eating him from the inside out. But somewhere under the agony, a strange thought surfaced. This was the first time in 4 years that someone had touched him like he mattered. Marlowe's small hands, Draven's firm pressure against his wounds, the bodyguard's careful grip, all of it proving he was real, visible, worth saving. The hospital appeared through the windshield like a fortress of white light. Draven was already out before the vehicle stopped, carrying Theron in his arms like he weighed nothing. Marlowe ran alongside them, still clutching her blood-soaked backpack, refusing to let go even when a nurse tried to pull her away. The automatic doors swallowed them all, and Theron's consciousness started to fragment into pieces that didn't quite fit together anymore. Doctor. Chen met them at a private entrance where security cameras had been conveniently angled away. She took one look at the wounds and snapped orders that sent nurses scattering like leaves in a storm. Theron felt hands cutting away his clothes, exposing skin that hadn't been properly clean in months. Shame tried to surface through the pain, but his body didn't have the energy for embarrassment. The examining room smelled like antiseptic and the peculiar metallic scent of emergency medicine. Bright lights turned the blood on his skin into something that looked fake, too red to be real. A nurse found the photograph when she removed his ruined jeans, the paper so soaked with blood that the woman's smile had turned crimson. Draven snatched it, before anyone else could look too closely, his face going completely still as he studied what remained visible. His lips moved, forming words Theron couldn't hear over the sound of medical equipment being wheeled into position. Then, the boss's eyes lifted, searching Theron's face with an intensity that felt like being dissected. Marlowe was crying in the corner where a nurse had finally convinced her to wait, her pink backpack abandoned on a chair. Blood covered her school uniform, her hands, even her light-up shoes. She looked like a child who'd walked through a war zone, which wasn't far from the truth. Draven glanced at her, something breaking in his expression before he locked it down again. Dr. Chen's fingers pressed against Theron's neck, checking his pulse while simultaneously examining the head wound. The temple shot was lucky. Another inch and we'd be having a very different conversation. The chest wound missed his heart by centimeters. The shoulder's going to need surgery to repair the bone damage. Her voice was clinical, but her hands shook slightly as she worked. They wheeled Theron toward an operating room, the ceiling tiles passing overhead in a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. Draven walked beside the gurney, still holding the blood-soaked photograph. He was talking to someone on his phone, his voice dropping into ranges that suggested whoever was listening should be very afraid. Names were mentioned, addresses recited, promises made that sounded like death sentences delivered in Italian. The anesthesiologist appeared above Theron's face, explaining something about counting backward from 10. But Theron's eyes stayed locked on Draven, watching the man who controlled Jersey City's Underworld stare at a photograph like it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago. The resemblance was there if you knew to look for it. The same sharp cheekbones, the identical way their eyes narrowed when processing information. Numbers were being spoken somewhere, but Theron couldn't remember what they meant. His tongue felt thick, his thoughts scattering like marbles dropped on tile. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Draven turning the photograph over, reading the handwriting on the back, and his face going absolutely white. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments that refused to form a complete picture. Beeping machines, hushed voices arguing in the hallway, pain that had teeth and claws, despite whatever drugs were being pumped into his veins. Theron's eyelids felt like they'd been glued shut, but eventually he forced them open to find a private room that belonged in a luxury hotel, not a hospital. Draven sat in a leather chair beside the bed, his suit jacket gone and his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, stubble darkening his jaw and shadows bruising the skin under his eyes. On the table beside him sat the photograph, now preserved in a plastic evidence bag, and a manila folder thick with documents. The boss noticed immediately when Theron's breathing pattern changed. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, studying Theron's face with an expression that mixed wonder and grief in equal measures. The DNA results came back this morning. 48 hours, they told me, was impossible, but money makes impossible things happen fast. His voice cracked on the last word. Theron tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. A straw appeared at his lips before he could figure out how to ask, Draven holding the cup with surprising steadiness. The water tasted like chemicals and relief, coating his throat enough to make words possible. Marlowe? The name came out as barely a whisper. Safe, downstairs in the cafeteria eating pancakes and telling everyone who'll listen about how her hero saved her life. Draven's smile was brittle, like glass about to shatter. She's been camped outside your room for 3 days. I finally bribed her with chocolate chip pancakes to give us privacy for this conversation. The folder opened, spilling pages across the hospital blanket. Theron saw his own face in a photograph he'd never known existed. A baby picture, maybe 6 months old, grinning toothlessly at whoever held the camera. More photos showed the woman from his pocket, younger and laughing, her hand resting on a rounded belly, and then pictures of Draven, years ago, his arm around the woman's shoulders, with an expression of unguarded happiness that seemed impossible on his current face. Her name was Celeste, Draven said, his voice rough with emotions he wasn't bothering to hide. She was the only person who ever made me want to be something other than what I am. We had 6 months together before my uncle decided that love was a weakness that would destroy the family. The documents told the rest of the story in cold, clinical language. A car accident on the Jersey City Bridge that wasn't an accident at all. A pregnant woman who supposedly died on impact. Her body never recovered from the Hudson River. A 2-year-old child who vanished into the foster system under a falsified identity, hidden so thoroughly that even Draven's extensive resources couldn't locate him. Lorenzo thought he was saving me from domesticity, from going soft. He arranged everything. The accident, the cover-up, making sure you disappeared where I'd never find you. Draven's hands clenched into fists. He raised me to be what I am now. And all this time, you were 5 miles away, sleeping in alleys, eating from dumpsters, while I lived in a penthouse that should have been yours. Theron's brain struggled to process information that rewrote 15 years of understanding. The hunger, the cold, the endless nights of wondering why no one wanted him. All of it orchestrated by someone who thought love made men weak. The photograph in his pocket had been right all along. He had been someone's everything, before violence and ambition stole that away. Lorenzo tried again 3 nights ago. Same method. Hired guns, silenced weapons, eliminate the weakness. Draven's voice dropped to something deadly quiet. Except this time his target was Marlowe, because apparently one child wasn't enough to erase. He wanted to free me from attachment, make me the perfect ruthless leader he'd always envisioned. The machine beside Theron's bed started beeping faster, tracking his accelerating heart rate. Draven's hand landed on his wrist, gentle despite the violence vibrating under his skin. He's been handled, permanently. I made sure his last moments included full understanding of exactly what he'd destroyed and why that was going to cost him everything. Silence stretched between them like broken glass, sharp and impossible to navigate safely. Theron stared at the photographs scattered across his hospital blanket, each image rewriting a history he'd constructed from scraps and desperate hope. The woman's smile looked different now that he knew she'd died trying to protect him. Her love turned into a weapon someone else had used for murder. Draven stood and walked to the window, his back rigid with control that was clearly costing him. Outside, Jersey City sprawled in afternoon sunlight, oblivious to the fact that its most powerful man was standing in a hospital room confronting the son he'd never known existed. Traffic moved in predictable patterns far below, normal life continuing while their world rebuilt itself from ashes. I searched for 2 years after she disappeared, Draven said, his reflection ghosting in the window glass. Hired every investigator, called in every favor, threatened everyone who might know something. Lorenzo looked me in the eyes daily and helped search, all while knowing exactly where Celeste's body was buried. The betrayal in Draven's voice carried 15 years of accumulated weight that threatened to crush them both. Theron shifted against the pillows, pain flaring through his shoulder despite the medication. A nurse had mentioned the bullet-shattered bone fragments that required 3 hours of reconstructive surgery. He'd carry that scar forever, a permanent reminder of the night his life split into before and after. The thought settled in his chest alongside the physical pain, both wounds that would heal, but never truly disappear. The foster records were falsified so thoroughly that even criminal databases didn't flag the inconsistencies. Draven continued, turning back to face him. They gave you a different last name, altered your birthday by 6 months, and placed you with a family in Newark. How did you end up back in Jersey City? His eyes searched Theron's face for answers to questions he hadn't yet asked. The resemblance was undeniable now that they occupied the same space, identical bone structure, the same way their mouths tightened when processing difficult information. Theron's throat worked around words that felt too big to speak. The foster father liked his liquor more than feeding kids. I ran when I was 11. figured the streets couldn't be worse than his fists. The memory tasted like fear and winter cold, nights when he genuinely believed he might freeze to death under highway overpasses. He'd learned to move through the city like smoke, invisible and untouchable, because visibility meant danger from adults who saw homeless kids as targets. Survival had required becoming a ghost in plain sight, present but unnoticed until the moment he'd thrown himself between bullets and Marlowe. "You were 4 miles from my house for 4 years, Draven said flatly, sitting down again with the heaviness of someone whose legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "Sleeping in alleys while I ate 5-course dinners, digging through trash while closets in my penthouse held clothes I never wore." His hands clenched into fists on his thighs, knuckles going white with pressure. Theron watched emotions cycle through the man's face: grief, rage, guilt, and something that looked like desperate hope fighting against years of practiced control. Outside the hospital window, a helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight cutting through the darkness as it tracked something below. Theron wondered if it was police or news media, whether someone else's crisis was unfolding, while his entire existence got rewritten in a private room with leather chairs and hushed conversations. The manila folder still lay open across the bed, documents spilling their secrets in clinical language that couldn't capture the actual weight of what had been stolen. Birth certificates with falsified names, court orders signed by judges who'd been paid to look the other way, even a death certificate for Celeste that listed her remains as unrecoverable due to water damage. The paperwork of erasure, all bearing Lorenzo's fingerprints despite his name appearing nowhere official. "He used to bring me coffee," Draven said suddenly, his voice hollow with betrayal's specific flavor. "Every morning for 13 years after she died, Lorenzo would show up at my office with espresso and ask how I was holding up. Like he gave a damn about my grief when he was the architect of it." The ritual of false comfort made Theron's stomach turn. He thought about all the people who'd walked past him in alleys, the ones who'd looked through him like he was transparent. At least they'd been honest in their indifference. They hadn't murdered his mother, and then pretended to care about his suffering. A different nurse entered, checking monitors and adjusting IV drips with practiced efficiency. She smiled at Theron like he was just another patient, unaware she was tending to the lost heir of Jersey City's criminal empire. When she left, the silence felt louder than before, weighted with all the years that could have been different. The machines beeped their steady rhythm, marking time that couldn't be recovered or rewritten no matter how much money Draven threw at the problem. Theron studied the photographs again, searching the baby's face for recognition that wouldn't come. "Marlowe needs to know," Draven said suddenly, his voice shifting into something that sounded almost vulnerable. "She's been calling you her hero, but she deserves to understand you're actually her brother, that the boy who took bullets for her shares her blood, her history, half her DNA." The word brother landed like a physical thing, solid and real and terrifying. Theron had fantasized about family since he was old enough to understand what the concept meant, but his imaginings had never included a 6-year-old sister or a father who controlled the city through fear. "The doctors say you'll need 6 weeks minimum before the shoulder heals enough for physical therapy," Draven continued, pulling a phone from his pocket. "Then another 3 months before full strength returns. You'll stay at the penthouse during recovery. I've already had a room prepared next to Marlowe's." Theron's laugh came out bitter and sharp. "You think I'm just going to move into your house? Play happy family like the last 15 years didn't happen? Like I didn't spend last Tuesday eating moldy bread from a dumpster?" Draven's jaw tightened, but his eyes held something that looked like understanding beneath the hurt. He set his phone down on the side table with deliberate care, the kind of controlled movement that suggested violence was being actively suppressed. The air between them felt charged with 15 years of missed birthdays and unanswered questions. "I think you don't have anywhere else to go," he said quietly, the brutal honesty cutting deeper than any accusation could have. "I think those bullet wounds make you vulnerable to every enemy I've accumulated over the years." The truth of it settled like lead in Theron's stomach. 3 people had tried to kill Marlowe, which meant they'd targeted Draven's weakness. Now that the boy from the alley had a name and a connection, he'd become a target too. "Lorenzo wasn't working alone," Draven continued, his voice dropping into registers that suggested death sentences being calculated. "He had contacts in the foster system, bribes paid to judges, entire networks built around keeping you hidden. Those people know you exist now, and they know what you mean to me." Theron's fingers found the edge of the hospital blanket, gripping it hard enough that his knuckles ached. The simple act of saving Marlowe had painted a target on his back, bigger than anything he'd faced living on the streets. Celeste died on the bridge because Lorenzo hired professionals who knew how to make murders look like accidents, Draven said, standing again to pace the small room. The car went into the Hudson at the deepest point. They never recovered her body because there was nothing left to recover after it was weighted down with chains and concrete. The clinical details made Theron's stomach turn. His mother, and the word felt foreign in his mind, had been murdered with premeditation and precision. Not a crime of passion, but a calculated removal of an obstacle. She knew she was pregnant when Lorenzo started making threats, Draven continued, his hands flexing at his sides like they wanted to wrap around someone's throat. She came to me 3 days before the accident, begging me to leave the family, to run away with her and start over somewhere Lorenzo couldn't find us. I told her she was being paranoid. The guilt in his voice could have filled the Hudson River. Theron recognized that particular flavor of self-hatred. He'd tasted it himself every time he'd failed to find enough food. Every night he'd gone to sleep hungry because he wasn't fast enough or smart enough to survive better. I was 27 and stupid enough to believe family loyalty meant something, Draven said, stopping at the window again. Thought Lorenzo wanted what was best for me, that his concerns about Celeste came from love rather than ambition. I didn't understand that to him. Love was the enemy of power. Outside, the sun was setting, painting Jersey City in shades of orange and gold that looked too beautiful for the ugliness being discussed. Theron wondered how many other people in those buildings carried secrets this heavy, how many lives had been shattered by violence disguised as protection. She called me the night it happened, Draven continued, his reflection in the window showing a face carved from grief. Said she was taking you somewhere safe, that Lorenzo had people following her. I told her to come to the restaurant, that I'd meet her there with security. She never made it. The timestamp on the phone record showed 9:47 p.m. Draven had included them in the folder like evidence he'd been studying for years, trying to find something he'd missed. Celeste's last words to him had been, "I love you, but I love him more right now," referring to the unborn child she was trying to save. 3 minutes later, her car went off the bridge. Theron traced the edge of one document with his finger, a coroner's report that declared death by drowning, despite no body being recovered. The medical examiner who'd signed it had retired to Florida 6 months later with enough money to buy a beachfront property. Another piece in Lorenzo's carefully constructed lie. Another person who'd valued cash over truth. She had a bag packed, Draven said, pulling out his phone and scrolling to a photo that made his hands shake. Police found it washed up 3 miles downstream. Baby clothes, formula, a stuffed rabbit she'd bought the week before. Everything except her and you. The image on the screen showed a waterlogged diaper bag, its contents arranged on a metal table, like artifacts from an archaeological dig. Theron could see tiny onesies with animals on them, a book about teaching babies to sleep, all the hopes of a woman who'd never gotten to use any of it. His mother had been preparing to run, to save them both, and Lorenzo had made sure her preparation became evidence in her own murder. The restaurant, Rosso Elegante, where Theron had been sleeping in the alley for 3 months, mere feet from where his mother had been heading the night she died. The cruel irony of it made something crack in his chest. The police report said she lost control on the bridge during a rainstorm, Draven said, turning back to face him. Single vehicle accident, no witnesses, body swept away by the current. I knew immediately it was a lie. Celeste drove like she was afraid of her own shadow. She wouldn't have been speeding, wouldn't have lost control. But grief and suspicion weren't enough without proof. Draven had torn apart the city looking for evidence, calling in favors from judges and cops. But Lorenzo had covered his tracks too well. I found out the truth 2 years later when one of Lorenzo's hired men got drunk and started talking, Draven said, his voice going flat and cold. By then I was deeper in the family business, had blood on my hands that made me complicit in the same violence that killed Celeste. I couldn't walk away without starting a war that would have destroyed everything. So he'd stayed, building power while pretending not to know his uncle had murdered the only woman he'd ever loved. Theron tried to imagine living with that knowledge, eating meals across from your mother's killer, and found he couldn't. Lorenzo told me last year that Celeste had been weak, that removing her had freed me to become what I needed to be, Draven said, and now his hands were shaking with barely controlled rage. Said I should thank him for making me strong enough to lead the family into the next generation. He actually expected gratitude. The revelation hung in the air like poison. Theron understood then why Draven had handled Lorenzo permanently, not just for attempting to kill Marlowe, but for 15 years of living lies. The door burst open without warning, and Marlowe launched herself into the room like a small hurricane. Her face lit up when she saw Theron awake, chocolate smeared across her chin, and her pink backpack, now washed clean of blood, bouncing against her shoulders. "You're awake!" she shrieked, scrambling onto the bed before any of the bodyguards stationed outside could stop her. Her small hands grabbed Theron's uninjured arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so tiny. Draven moved to intercede, but Theron shook his head slightly. The pain from her bouncing on the mattress was worth the look of pure joy on her face. She was real in a way nothing else in this room felt real. Uncomplicated happiness that he hadn't experienced in so long. He'd forgotten what it tasted like. "I made you a card," Marlowe announced, digging through her backpack with the intensity of someone on a critical mission. "And I drew you a picture of you being a superhero because that's what you are, Ms. Peterson said it was the best drawing in the whole class. The card's cover showed a figure with yellow crayon hair standing in front of another smaller figure with brown curls. Clearly Marlowe based on the excessive use of pink. Inside, she'd written in uneven letters, "Thank you for saving me. You are the bravest. Love, your sister Marlowe." The word sister had been traced over multiple times, like she'd wanted to make absolutely sure it was legible. Theron's hands trembled as he held the construction paper, aware that this moment mattered more than the expensive medical equipment or the DNA tests. This was a 6-year-old choosing to claim him, not because genetics demanded it, but because she wanted him to be part of her world. "I didn't know what brothers like," Marlowe added, her voice going slightly uncertain. "So I also got you this." She pulled out a small stuffed animal, a dog with floppy ears and a red collar. "His name is Guard, because that's what you did. You guarded me, but you can change his name if you want." The gift was so earnest it physically hurt to accept. Theron took the stuffed dog, its synthetic fur soft against his palm, and realized he'd never owned a toy before. Not one that was his, that hadn't been stolen or found in a trash bin. The weight of that deprivation hit him sideways, not just hunger and cold, but the absence of childhood itself. She produced a piece of construction paper folded in half, covered in crayon drawings of stick figures. One figure with yellow hair stood in front of a smaller figure, red marks indicating the bullets. Stars surrounded the tall figure's head like a halo. Theron's throat closed up completely. He'd never received a card before. Never had anyone draw him a picture. The simple gift meant more than all the expensive medical equipment keeping him alive. "Marlowe," Draven said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "We need to talk to you about something important, about who Theron really is, and why he was in that alley the night he saved you." The girl's expression shifted from joy to curiosity, her head tilting in a way that reminded Theron of a bird. "Is he a secret agent? Is that why he knew the bad men were coming?" "No, sweetheart," Draven said, and his voice carried a tenderness Theron hadn't heard before. "He's your brother, your actual brother, who I didn't know existed until 3 days ago when the doctors ran tests on his blood." Marlowe's mouth formed a perfect O of surprise. She looked between Draven and Theron, her young mind visibly working through the implications. "Like a real brother? Not a pretend one? Like a real brother," Draven confirmed, pulling out the photograph that had started everything. "This woman was his mother and she was someone I loved very much. She died before Theron was born, and bad people made sure he and I could never find each other." The girl studied the photograph with an intensity that seemed too mature for 6 years old. When she looked back at Theron, her eyes were wet. "So you've been alone this whole time? Without a family?" The simple question devastated him more than any of the violence he'd survived. Theron nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. Marlowe threw her arms around his neck with enough force to make his shoulders scream in protest. "Well, you're not alone anymore," she declared fiercely into his ear. "You're my brother, and you live with us now, and anyone who's mean to you has to deal with me and Daddy." Over her head, Theron met Draven's eyes. The man's expression held a mixture of hope and fear, waiting to see if Theron would reject this offering of family, or accept it, despite everything that had been stolen. "I don't know how to be part of a family," Theron admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know how to live in a house, or eat at a table, or any of the normal things people do." Marlowe pulled back, her small hands framing his face. "That's okay. I didn't know how to ride a bike, but Daddy taught me. We'll teach you family stuff, and it'll be easy because you're already good at the hard parts." "What hard parts?" Theron asked despite himself. "Loving people enough to take bullets for them," she said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "The rest is just learning where the bathroom is and what time dinner happens." Draven's laugh sounded like it had been startled out of him, breaking the tension that had filled the room since Theron woke up. Even Theron felt his mouth twitch toward something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. A knock interrupted the moment. Dr. Chen entering with a tablet, and the expression that suggested both good and concerning news. The bone fragments are healing ahead of schedule, but we found something else in the blood work that I need to discuss. Her eyes flicked to Marlowe, then back to Draven with a question. He nodded once, and the doctor continued. Theron's showing signs of severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and early stages of several conditions consistent with long-term homelessness. None of it life-threatening now that we're treating it, but recovery will take months, not weeks. The clinical assessment laid bare exactly how close to death Theron had been living even before the bullets. Draven's expression went carefully blank, and the way Theron was learning meant he was feeling too much to show any of it. "We'll handle it," Draven said flatly, standing and pulling his phone out again. "Whatever he needs, specialists, treatments, physical therapy. Money isn't an object. Fix everything that can be fixed." Dr. Chen nodded and left, taking her tablet of uncomfortable truths with her. Marlowe had gone quiet, her small face troubled, as she processed the idea that her newly discovered brother had been slowly dying from neglect for years. "I'm okay now," Theron told her, surprised to find he meant it. The pain was real, and the recovery would be brutal, but for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't facing it alone. 3 weeks crawled by in that hospital room before Dr. Chen finally cleared Theron for discharge. The walls had become familiar in a way that made him uncomfortable. Too clean, too safe, too different from everything he'd known. Marlowe visited every day after school, bringing homework she didn't need help with but insisted on doing at his bedside anyway. She'd taken to calling him "there" because his full name felt too formal for a brother. The nickname stuck despite Theron's protests, and now even the nurses used it when they came to check his vitals. Draven appeared at odd hours, sometimes at 3 in the morning when the city was quietest, and his empire required less immediate attention. He'd sit in that leather chair and talk about things that didn't matter: weather, traffic, the new chef at Rosso Elegante who couldn't make risotto worth a damn. They were learning each other through small observations rather than grand revelations. Theron noticed how Draven's left hand always stayed near his weapon, even in this secure room. Draven noticed how Theron counted the exits every time someone new entered, mapping escape routes his body had memorized before his mind caught up. The physical therapy started on day 12, a torturous process that involved moving his shoulder through ranges of motion that felt like being shot all over again. The therapist was a woman named Rosa who'd worked with gunshot victims before and didn't coddle him when he wanted to quit. "Your father's paying me to fix you, not to let you feel sorry for yourself," she'd said bluntly during their second session. The word father had made Theron flinch harder than the exercises. But she was right, and he hated that she was right. The weakness in his shoulder represented vulnerability he couldn't afford now that he wore a target. So he pushed through the pain until sweat soaked his hospital gown and his vision whited out at the edges. Draven watched those sessions from the doorway sometimes, his expression unreadable. Once, Theron caught something that looked like pride flickering across the man's face when he completed a particularly brutal set of movements without crying out. The nutrition plan, Dr. Chen implemented, was almost as painful as the physical therapy. Years of malnutrition meant his stomach had shrunk, his body unaccustomed to regular meals. They started him on small portions 6 times a day, gradually increasing as his system remembered how to process actual food instead of garbage. The first time he threw up from eating too much too fast, Marlowe held his hand and told him about when she'd gotten food poisoning from bad shrimp. "Daddy said my insides were staging a revolution," she'd explained seriously. "I think your insides are just confused about being treated nice." Her simple logic made more sense than any medical explanation. Theron's body was confused, about safety, about abundance, about the concept of tomorrow being better than today, instead of just another fight for survival. The nightmares started on day 15. He'd wake up gasping, back in the alley with 3 guns pointed at Marlowe, except in the dreams he was always too slow. The bullets would hit her instead, and he'd watch her small body crumple, while Draven's screams echoed off brick walls. A trauma counselor appeared after the 3rd consecutive night of waking up the entire ward. She talked about PTSD and survivor's guilt using words that felt too clinical for what actually happened inside his head when he closed his eyes. The counselor had left pamphlets on his bedside table, glossy brochures about processing trauma and rebuilding after violence. They featured stock photos of diverse people looking pensively into the distance, as if contemplating their healing journeys. Theron had thrown them in the trash the moment she left. unwilling to see his experience reduced to marketing materials. But the nightmares didn't care about his rejection of official help. They evolved, becoming more elaborate as his mind processed layers of trauma he hadn't had time to acknowledge while surviving. Now it wasn't just Marlo dying. It was Celeste drowning in the Hudson while he watched from the bridge, unable to move or scream or do anything except witness her disappearance. Some nights he'd wake up convinced he was back in the alley, the hospital room transforming into brick walls, and the smell of garbage overwhelming the antiseptic cleanliness. Those were the worst episodes because reality felt negotiable, like he couldn't trust which world was actually real, the one where he had a father and sister, or the one where he was still invisible and alone. Dr. Chen had mentioned medication for the nightmares, pills that could suppress REM sleep and reduce the vivid imagery. Theron had refused, unwilling to numb himself when alertness had kept him alive for so long. The exhaustion was brutal, but it felt more honest than chemically induced peace. "You saved her," the counselor kept repeating, like Theron needed convincing. "Your actions meant she's alive and safe. The dreams are your mind processing what could have happened, not what did happen." But knowing the difference didn't make the nightmares stop. It just meant he understood why he couldn't sleep, which somehow made it worse. Draven started sleeping in the chair on night 17, after Theron woke up shouting Marlo's name loud enough to bring security running. He didn't ask permission or explain himself, just showed up with a blanket and positioned himself between Theron and the door. "You think I can't protect myself?" Theron had asked, angry at the implication of weakness. "I think you've been protecting yourself alone for 15 years and you're exhausted," Draven replied quietly. "Let someone else stand watch for once. That's what family does." The word family still felt foreign, like clothing that didn't quite fit right. But Theron stopped arguing, and the nightmares became slightly less frequent with another person breathing in the darkness. On day 20, they brought him real clothes. Not the expensive designer items Theron had expected, but jeans and a simple black t-shirt that felt soft against skin used to rougher textures. The tags were cut out, and he suspected Marlo had something to do with that thoughtful detail. Getting dressed without help took 20 minutes and left him sweating from exertion. His shoulders screamed protest at every movement, and he had to sit down twice before he managed to get his shoes on. Independence had never felt so much like failure. Draven found him sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, fully dressed, but unable to stand without assistance. Neither of them spoke about it. The boss simply offered his arm, and Theron took it, and they walked out of that room together in silence that somehow said everything. The elevator ride down felt longer than 3 weeks of recovery. Theron watched the numbers descend, aware that he was leaving the last safe space he'd known. The hospital had been liminal, not his past life, but not quite his future either. Walking out those doors meant accepting what came next. The SUV waited at the private exit, same vehicle that had rushed him to the hospital with his blood soaking the leather seats. Someone had cleaned it thoroughly, but Theron swore he could still smell copper underneath the scent of expensive detergent and air freshener. Marlo sat in the back already, her pink backpack on the seat beside her, and a laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up when they entered, her face splitting into a grin that made her look even younger than 6. "I made you a welcome home video," she announced, turning the screen so Theron could see crude animation of stick figures walking into a house. "It has instructions for everything important, like where the bathroom is, and when we eat breakfast, and which bedroom is yours." The simple gesture hit harder than it should have. Theron slid into the seat beside her, his shoulder protesting the movement, and watched her badly animated tour of a place he'd never seen. Her narration included critical details like, "This is where Daddy keeps the ice cream," and "This room is boring, it's just his office." Draven settled into the front passenger seat, speaking quietly to the driver before the vehicle pulled into Jersey City traffic. The city looked different from inside an armored SUV than it had from street level. Smaller somehow, more manageable when you weren't worried about where you'd sleep that night. They passed the alley behind Rosso Elegante, and Theron's chest tightened involuntarily. His cardboard shelter was gone, the space cleaned and empty like he'd never existed there. 3 months of his life erased by someone with a dumpster and basic cleaning supplies. "I had it cleared out," Draven said without turning around, apparently able to read minds or just recognize the significance of them passing that specific spot. "Your things, what little there was, are in your new room, including that cardboard you slept on, if you want to keep it." The offer was absurd and thoughtful in equal measure. Theron didn't know if he wanted to keep any reminders of sleeping in garbage, but having the choice felt important. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building downtown that Theron had passed 100 times without realizing anyone actually lived there. The lobby was all marble and gold fixtures, the kind of place that would have had security throwing him out if he'd tried to enter before bullets had rewritten his status. An elevator required a special key to access the residential floors. Draven inserted it without ceremony, and they rose in silence, broken only by Marlowe's continued narration of her welcome video. She'd added sound effects using her own voice, car noises, door chimes, even a recording of herself singing about breakfast. The doors opened directly into the penthouse, bypassing any shared hallway. Theron stepped out onto hardwood floors that probably cost more than he'd seen in his entire life. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Jersey City and Manhattan beyond, the skyline glittering in afternoon sun. "Your room's this way," Marlowe said, grabbing his uninjured hand and pulling him down a hall wide enough that 3 people could walk side by side comfortably. "It's next to mine, like Daddy said, so if you have nightmares, you can knock on the wall and I'll come over." She pushed open a door, revealing a space that made Theron's brain struggle to process what he was seeing. The room was bigger than the entire ground floor of his old foster house. A massive bed dominated one wall, covered in blankets that looked soft enough to be a fire hazard, but it was the other wall that made his throat close up. Someone, probably Draven, had recreated his alley space in miniature. The cardboard was there, carefully preserved. His collection of found objects arranged on shelves like museum pieces. Even the photograph of Celeste, now cleaned and preserved in a proper frame, held a place of honor on the nightstand. "Daddy said you might need familiar things while you adjust," Marlowe explained, watching his face carefully. "So he had people bring everything from your old spot. Is that okay? Are you mad?" Theron shook his head, unable to form words past the emotion lodged in his chest. The gesture was simultaneously the most thoughtful and most devastating thing anyone had ever done for him. His poverty turned into decoration, his suffering acknowledged and preserved like it mattered. "There's also new stuff," Marlowe continued, opening a closet that revealed more clothes than Theron had worn in his entire life. "Daddy had people guess your size, but if things don't fit, we can get different ones. And there's a bathroom through there with a shower that has really good water pressure." Theron walked into the bathroom, flipping the light switch to reveal marble countertops and a shower enclosed in glass that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. The towels hanging on heated racks were thicker than any blanket he'd ever slept under. He turned on the shower experimentally, and water cascaded from multiple heads with enough pressure to actually hurt if you stood directly underneath. The mirror above the sink showed a reflection he barely recognized. 3 weeks of regular meals had started filling out the hollow places in his cheeks, though his eyes still carried shadows that spoke of years spent in survival mode. The scar on his temple from the grazing bullet had formed a thin white line that disappeared into his hairline, proof that he'd almost died, but hadn't quite managed it. Personal care products lined a shelf in the shower, everything still in its original packaging because no one had used this bathroom before him. Shampoo, conditioner, body wash and scents he couldn't identify because they weren't the generic soap from public restrooms. Even a razor and shaving cream, despite the fact that his facial hair was still patchy and adolescent. Someone had thought through every detail of what he might need, anticipating requirements he'd stopped thinking about after years of making do with nothing. The attention to his comfort felt almost aggressive in its thoroughness, like Draven was trying to compensate for 15 years of neglect in a single bathroom renovation. She said it like good water pressure was something everyone knew about, a casual luxury rather than something Theron had experienced maybe twice in the past 4 years. He walked to the window instead, looking out at the city, from a height that made everything below seem like a toy model. From up here, you couldn't see the alleys where kids slept in cardboard, couldn't smell the garbage or feel the concrete's retained heat. Jersey City looked clean and manageable, all its ugliness hidden by distance and altitude. "I know it's a lot," Draven said from the doorway, his voice careful. "If you need to leave, go back to what you know, I won't stop you. But I'm hoping you'll try this first. Try letting someone take care of you for once." The offer hung in the air between them. Theron could walk away right now, and based on Draven's expression, the man would probably give him money and resources to do it safely. No obligations, no strings, just a chance to return to the devil he knew. But Marlowe was holding his hand, her grip tight and warm and real. And through the doorway, he could see her room across the hall, pink walls visible through an open door, stuffed animals arranged on her bed with careful precision. a sister he'd never imagined having, offering family he'd never thought to want. "I'll try," Theron said finally, the words feeling like surrender and victory simultaneously. "I don't know how to do any of this, but I'll try." Marlowe squeezed his hand 3 times in rapid succession, some kind of code he didn't understand yet. "That's all you have to do," she said with the confidence of someone who'd never had to doubt whether she deserved good things. "Trying is enough. The rest you learn by doing." The first family dinner happened that same evening, and Theron approached it with more anxiety than he'd felt facing down 3 armed men. The dining room table could seat 12, but felt intimate with only 3 chairs occupied. Marlowe sat to his left, Draven across from him, and they ate pasta that hadn't come from a dumpster for the first time in Theron's recent memory. He fumbled with the silverware, unsure which fork to use and hyper-aware of every sound he made. Marlowe copied his mistakes deliberately, making a game of it until the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. She'd knock over her water, then grin at him like they were co-conspirators in chaos. Draven watched them with an expression Theron was learning to recognize as carefully contained emotion. The man who ran Jersey City's underworld with an iron fist was completely undone by his daughter's laughter and his son's presence at his table. "We need to talk about what comes next," Draven said once the plates were cleared, his tone shifting into something more businesslike. "The people who tried to kill Marlowe know you exist now. They know what you mean to this family, which makes you a liability and a target in equal measure." The blunt assessment didn't surprise Theron. He'd known since waking up in that hospital that his life had become infinitely more complicated. Saving one person had put him in the crosshairs of everyone who wanted to hurt Draven. "I want you trained," Draven continued, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what looked like dossiers. "Self-defense, weapons handling, tactical awareness. You can't live your life looking over your shoulder, but you need to know how to protect yourself when looking isn't enough." The idea of becoming the kind of person who carried weapons and knew how to use them felt surreal. But Theron had learned young that survival sometimes meant becoming what circumstances demanded. He nodded his acceptance. "The training won't be easy," Draven warned, his expression shifting into something harder. "The people I'm bringing in don't coddle, and they won't go soft because you're recovering from bullet wounds. If you're going to carry the family name, you need to be able to defend it and yourself with equal skill." The underlying message was clear. Being Draven's son came with expectations that extended beyond blood relation. Theron would need to prove himself worthy of the protection and resources being offered, earn his place through competence rather than just genetic connection. It was fairer than he'd expected, more honest than simple acceptance would have been. "I also want you to learn the business," Draven continued, gesturing to documents spread across the table. "The legitimate operations and the other kind. You're my heir whether you want to be or not. And that means understanding how this empire actually functions. Knowledge is survival in this world." Marlowe had stopped paying attention to the serious conversation, instead building a tower out of her peas and carrots while humming under her breath. Her obliviousness to the weight of what was being discussed reminded Theron that she lived in a different reality, one where danger was abstract, and fathers were just fathers, not criminal masterminds navigating treacherous political waters daily. "There's also the matter of your education," Draven said, his finger swiping to a different screen. "You're 15, which means legally you should be in school. We can arrange private tutors if you prefer, or there's a private academy that handles students with complicated situations. Your choice." Choice. That word kept appearing in conversations, like Draven was trying to compensate for 15 years of having no choices by offering them constantly now. Theron appreciated it and resented it in equal measure. "Private tutors," he said after considering. "At least at first. I'm not ready for other kids and their questions." Marlowe perked up at that. "I can help with math. I'm really good at math. Ms. Peterson says I'm advanced for my age and might skip a grade next year." The offer was sweet and completely unhelpful since she was 6, but Theron found himself smiling anyway. "I'll definitely need your help with math," he told her seriously, and her face lit up like he'd promised her the world. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt increasingly less foreign. Mornings meant physical therapy with Rosa, who remained mercilessly efficient in rebuilding his shoulder's strength and range of motion. Afternoons brought tutors who evaluated his knowledge and built curriculum around the gaps 4 years of homelessness had created. Evenings belonged to Marlowe, who appointed herself his guide to normal family life. She taught him about movie nights and board games, about how to load a dishwasher and why you shouldn't put metal in the microwave. Lessons in domesticity from a 6-year-old who found his ignorance charming rather than shameful. Nights were harder, The nightmares persisted, though their frequency decreased. Theron would wake to find Marlowe curled up in the chair beside his bed, having somehow snuck past security to keep him company. Draven never said anything about it, just made sure she got to school on time regardless of where she'd slept. The self-defense training started in week 5, taught by a woman named Kira, who'd apparently done security work in places the government didn't officially acknowledge. She was efficient and brutal in her instruction, pushing Theron past what he thought his recovering shoulder could handle. Pain is information, she'd say every time he wanted to quit. Listen to it, learn from it, but don't let it make your decisions for you. The weapons training came later, once his shoulder had healed enough to handle recoil. Theron discovered he had a natural aptitude for firearms, his hands steady and his focus sharp. Kira seemed unsurprised, noting that survival instincts translated well to tactical thinking. 2 months after leaving the hospital, Draven announced it was time to make Theron's existence official, not just to the family, but to the city itself. A formal dinner where associates and allies could meet the lost heir who'd literally taken bullets to prove his worth. The suit they gave him cost more than he wanted to know. Marlowe supervised while staff helped him dress, insisting on adjusting his tie herself, even though she barely reached his chest. "You have to look perfect," she declared seriously. "Everyone's going to be watching you." The restaurant, not Rosso Elegante, but a different establishment Draven owned across town, had been closed to the public for the evening. Tables filled with men and women who controlled various pieces of Jersey City's legitimate and less than legitimate enterprises. They all stood when Draven entered with Theron at his side, and Marlowe holding his hand. The silence felt weighted with judgment and curiosity. These people had known Draven for years, watched him build power without attachments, without weaknesses. Now he was presenting them with 2 weaknesses, a daughter they already knew about, and a son who'd appeared from nowhere. "Most of you know the story by now," Draven said, his voice carrying across the room with effortless authority. "The boy who saved my daughter's life turned out to be my son, stolen from me before he was born by someone I trusted. That betrayal has been addressed. What matters now is that my family is whole, and anyone who thinks that makes us weak is welcome to test that theory." The threat underneath the words was unmistakable. Theron felt dozens of eyes assessing him, calculating whether he was genuinely valuable or just a liability Draven couldn't eliminate due to biology and sentiment. Then someone started clapping. A woman near the back with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. Others joined in, the applause building until the entire room acknowledged what Draven had said. Not agreement necessarily, but recognition that this was the reality they'd all have to accept. Dinner was a carefully choreographed dance of conversations and introductions. People approached throughout the evening, offering congratulations that ranged from genuine to calculated. Theron watched Draven's face for cues, learning to read who was actually happy for them, and who was already planning how to exploit this new dynamic. Marlowe charmed everyone effortlessly, telling the story of how Theron had saved her with enough dramatic flair that people laughed despite the violence inherent in the tale. She made it sound like a fairy tale, the hero appearing from nowhere to protect the princess, earning his place in the castle through bravery and sacrifice. Near the end of the evening, an older man approached their table alone. He had the kind of face that suggested violence was a familiar companion, but his expression softened slightly when he looked at Theron. "You've got your mother's eyes," he said quietly. "Celeste and I worked together before she met your father. She was a good woman who deserved better than what this life gave her." The acknowledgement of who she'd been, not just Draven's lost love, but a person in her own right, meant more than all the congratulations about joining the family. Theron nodded, unable to form words past the lump in his throat. The drive home was quiet, Marlowe asleep against Theron's shoulder, and Draven lost in thoughts he didn't share. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, Jersey City settling into its nighttime rhythm. From inside the armored SUV, it looked almost peaceful. Back at the penthouse, Draven helped carry Marlowe to her room while Theron headed to his own space. The cardboard from his alley life sat in the corner, a reminder of where he'd come from. But the bed was soft. The windows showed a view he was learning to trust, and down the hall slept 2 people who'd somehow become family. 3 months ago, Theron had been invisible, sleeping in garbage behind a restaurant and eating from dumpsters. Tonight, he'd sat at a table where the city's power brokers acknowledged his existence and his place in the empire Draven had built. The transformation felt impossible even while he was living through it. He pulled out his phone, another new possession he was still learning to use, and looked at the photo Marlowe had insisted they take before the dinner. The three of them dressed up, Marlo grinning between two people who shared her DNA and her determination to survive whatever came next. My everything, Celeste had written on the back of that old photograph. Saran understood now she'd been trying to tell him he was loved, that he mattered, that someday he'd find his way back to the family she'd died trying to protect. It had taken 15 years and 3 bullets, but he'd finally found what she'd wanted him to have, a place to belong, people to protect, and the knowledge that he was visible to someone who would never look away. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing this story reached you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me keep bringing you stories like Theron's journey from the streets to finding his family. See you in the next one.
Все равно, как бы, ну, сути дела не меняет, как бы зарплата плюс-минус везде там, ну, больше, чуть меньше. Как бы, и, наверное, это все, вот эта общая ситуация, наверное, у многих привела, во-первых, сфера развлечений, да, всякие там кредиты и так далее, настолько загоняют каждого в задницу человека. И об этом на самом деле никто так-то не говорит. Какое количество сейчас, допустим, даже в те же сложные времена такие, когда вот сейчас идет там специальная военная операция, да, где люди вообще умирают, в принципе, за какую-то сумму денег. Ну, то есть, какая мотивация, то есть, у мужика идти, типа, на войну, воевать и, ну, как бы заработать денег? Потому что он вот в обычной жизни не понимает, типа, как реализовать себя. Ну, он понимает, что он может пойти работать на какую-то работу, где зарплаты его все равно не будет хватать. Как бы тут тоже двойственная сторона. Хорошо, когда она есть, плохо, когда ее нету. Да, вот это маленькая даже зарплаты. Но морально-то ты все равно подавлен. Ты понимаешь, да, я там пойду туда, но как бы смысла мне этого не принесет большого. Да, у меня там станет, если я вообще не работаю и буду работать за 50 тысяч, хорошо, что они у меня есть, я смогу там покушать себе купить, но это же дизмораль. Когда ты заходишь в интернет и видишь, как люди там в Дубае летают, покупают себе огромное количество автомобилей какие-то, ну, много всего такого, что ты за эту зарплату себе никогда в жизни позволить не сможешь. И как человеку оставаться морально, типа, сильным? Что ему нужно делать? Ну, наверное, во-первых, это, наверное, все от семьи исходит, да? То есть, какая семья у тебя, как она построена. Если ты один живешь, это сложно, да, ты будешь сам себя, но у тебя, опять-таки, возможно, ну, родители, если есть, которые, друзья, поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, ну, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же, ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось. На данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все равно присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, и тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Новстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такой вот. И это борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали, а кто ты без костюма? На вот это, я филантроп, тудым-сюдым. Он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос, а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот, и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, к примеру, там, Мелстрой, задав ему этот вопрос, а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку